Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Talking Point series, which covers topics related to immigration, multiculturalism, diversity, and inclusion. I'm your host, Darrell Pinto. Talking Point is brought to you by New Canadians TV. The New Canadians is an information network for newcomers and would-be immigrants to Canada, and you can visit their website at newcanadians.tv or their YouTube channel, where this session is currently being live streamed. In today's episode, we are going to discuss the key findings from the recent Environics Institute report about the lived experiences of Syrian refugees who came into Canada between 2015 and 2016. To the audience members, thank you for joining us. I want to remind you that this is an interactive event, and I encourage you to type your questions via the Q&A tab on Zoom or the live chat box if you're watching on YouTube. You can also like questions submitted by someone else. So the more audience likes a question gets, it'll get pushed to the top of my screen, and it's more likely that I will ask it of the panelists. So let's get started. I am excited to welcome our four amazing panelists. Marwa, Khobieh, Executive Director at the Syrian Canadian Foundation, Keith Neuman, Senior Associate and author of the report we're going to be discussing from the Environics Institute for Survey Research, Mustafa Alio, Managing Director at Refugee Seat, and Talar Chichian, a lawyer who came to Canada in that wave 2015-2016. So welcome, everyone. I'd love to get started with some intros. So starting with Keith, can you tell us a little bit about your work and how it intersects with the refugee sector and or experience?
Well, thank you, Darrell, and thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel this evening. The Environics Institute is a small nonprofit. We do public interest social research, and some of our focus has been around issues of immigration and refugees and migration and multiculturalism in Canada. And this particular study was one that we launched a couple of years ago to really better understand and document the lived experience of refugees who came from Syria in 2015 and 2016. I think there was a lot of anecdotal data, a lot of stories in the media, but there was the need for some research to be national and to be comprehensive.
Great, thank you, Keith. Marwa, why don't you go next?
Sure. Thank you so much, Darrell, for moderating and organizing this important panel discussion. Good evening, everyone. My name is Marwa, and I'm the Executive Director of Syrian Foundation, and we started SDF back in 2015 and 16 in response to the Syrian refugee arrival in the GTA, Ontario, and specifically in particular with my personal experience, I'm Syrian Canadian myself. I was still living in Montreal when the first arrival of Syrian refugees came, and we co-founded an organization called Canadian Alliances for Syrian Aid, and I was heavily involved in the settlement work and supporting Syrian refugees in terms of language support, youth programs, and housing as well. And then after that, after years of volunteering, I decided this is the career that I really want to take on, and I moved to Toronto, and that's where SDF got their first funding, and I was SDF's first employee, and we grew a lot since then. There's a lot of lessons learned from the Syrian refugee crisis and the arrival of Syrians back then. Initially, SDF was really focusing on the settlement work because it was basically focusing on the emergency response of the community work. And then after that, we have expanded our programs and services, not just to Syrian refugees, but to diverse background of refugees and newcomers, because sadly, crises do happen every couple of years. And now we're supporting refugees from Ukraine and Afghanistan as well.
Thank you, Marwa. I'm curious to, over the course of this discussion, hear more about your perspective, because you would have seen the bird's eye view of
exactly. Yes.
Many families who arrived, during that time. Mustafa, I believe you have a very similar kind of perspective, but why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Darrell, and pleasure to be with everyone today. And hi. Again, Mustafa Alio, I'm the co-managing director for an international team that called Our Seat, Refugees Seeking Equal Access to the Table. we are a team that works right now, mandated to work with about 20 governments across the globe in terms of how to enhance their responses and create better responses and policies toward refugees, but in consultation with refugees and basically partnership with refugees by building mechanisms of consultations that are institutionalized in those governments. And Canada definitely was the first model to do so, and now getting expanded. But I think also I bring in other to the, the policy perspective and how government thinks and what people. I also come from a background of being refugee myself as an asylum seeker, but also a co-founder of Jumpstart Refugee Talent, which is a national organization that focuses on supporting refugees with economic integration, whether that would be meaningful employment or entrepreneurs. And Jumpstart also, like Syrian Foundation, started early on in end of 2015, early 2016, with the arrival of Syrian refugees coming to Canada. So definitely we've witnessed a lot of the work, a lot of the issues, barriers, successes of people. And today, and I think definitely we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more during the conversation, but thank you for having me again.
Great, thank you, Mustafa. And Talar, you're the single person on the panel today that actually arrived during that 2015-2016 period. And you want to maybe introduce yourself briefly?
That's correct. So good evening, everyone. Thank you, Darrell, for moderating this event. Yes, you're correct, Darrell. So I arrived in December of 2015. So the journey was not easy. So it took a lot. However, I'm happy that now I'm working as in an immigration field, primarily practicing refugee claims, refugee law. Since I went through in the same process, so I would like to help people who are going through the same struggle, let's say. I can understand their challenges, and I'm here to help everyone.
Okay, great. So Keith, I want to ask you about the 305 interviews you did as part of this research. Talar, by the way, were you one of the people interviewed by Keith for this piece?
No.
No, okay, good. We had a fresh perspective. So Keith, I mean, doing these 305 interviews for this research, what stood as the most notable, and was there anything that surprised you?
Well, there's lots to say, and I should point out we have a very detailed final report that's available publicly for those who might be frustrated by the limited details that we can get into this evening. So we talked to 305 Syrian refugees who arrived in 2015 and 2016 across the country, doing our best to be representative in terms of region, age, gender, mission stream, and so forth. And these were in-depth interviews that lasted an hour or more. Some lasted 2 hours, where we really got to ask people about a lot of different aspects of their lives before they came, when they arrived, what their current lives were like, and how they were looking towards the future. And again, it covers a lot of ground, but I think perhaps the biggest takeaway is that across the sample, most, not all, but most of the people we interviewed felt very good about their lives in Canada, and were doing reasonably well by somewhat objective measures. Some obviously had more difficulties and challenges than others when they arrived because of language, because of other circumstances. But when we interviewed people 5 or 6 years later, which is when we were doing our research, so we really wanted to find out how refugees were doing after a number of years in the country, not just the initial period. There were surprisingly few differences across this group in terms of how they felt their lives were going, their attachment to Canada, their current situation in terms of different aspects of their lives, and their outlook for the future. Maybe that's not surprising, but I think it's certainly notable, and certainly isn't something that I think we could take for granted. So I think the documentation has been really, really good. In terms of surprises, I think maybe I think what's notable is that those refugees who perhaps started with had the most challenges in the beginning and the more difficult time, the gap between them and the others seemed to narrow quite dramatically over the 5 or 6 years. And so it was much more consistent across the sample by the time we spoke with them.
That's great, Keith. Mustafa and Marwa, I mean, having on the ground experience with many families, would your experience corroborate what Keith just said in terms of things that he found most notable and surprised him? Marwa, maybe I'll ask you first.
Sure. Now, in terms of when I met with Keith during the holidays and I went through the report and the research findings, I told him I'm pleasantly impressed how it really reflects on our personal experience with working with Syrian refugee families, especially in the early stage, and it really does have a positive impact. How many of these refugee families are doing very well in a way that exactly what Talar mentioned, that many of them now are supporting other newly arrived refugees who are coming. They're giving back to the community. So that really shows how much they feel empowered, supported, and heard by the community. And I would say one of the things that really worked well with the Syrian refugees in 2015 and 16 is how also media really played a key role in having a positive impact and encouraged the members of the community to help, to volunteer, and take a huge role in coming to the hotels, and thousands were coming all at once. I know how overwhelming it was for settlement agencies to provide services and settlement work for these refugee families. So they accepted help from grassroots organizations like SDF. We didn't have a lot of experience in the nonprofit sector, but we were Syrian Canadians ourselves. We had our experience with the Syrian crisis before in international projects. So that kind of partnership with settlement agencies like COSTI really gave us a push and a bridge to an ability to help and support Syrian refugees back then. And that's one of the key things that I always mention to other grassroots organizations and other bigger settlement organizations like COSTI and Polyculture, that role in a way that were mentoring us and supporting us even through grants applications for us in order to grow and expand our knowledge to other families was really helpful. And the other, I would say, key component was the support that Syrian gave. I would say back in 2018 or 19 is when we noticed that many of them have entrepreneurial skills and they want to run their businesses here. And I would say Mustafa would tackle more on that through Jumpstart, especially that they focus on employment. But that was also another positive impact. I live in Mississauga, and every couple of weeks we hear a new restaurant opening by a Syrian family in a way that they want to give back to the community and be productive citizens in Canada as well.
Thanks.
I'll pass it on to Mustafa to share more.
Mustafa, would you go ahead?
No, I think in terms of the focus we got from the report, and Keith, thank you for the report, the 96 pages, I got a chance to spend a few hours today on them, and a pretty cool outcomes just kind of to match it with people working on the ground. So a lot of things that came in the report were actually true and confirmed. For example, the sense of belonging for refugees and also kind of return refugees versus others or kind of the local community always higher than everyone else. The general theme and gratitude of feeling safe and coming to Canada, that was something that we felt all. The idea of employment, I think employment and language, I know it was kind of tough and this was like a major barrier to a lot of people. I kind of report confirmed and it was kind of even more than I thought in a way, and maybe I know that I'm a little bit subconscious in a way. Sometimes, yeah, there are barriers, but maybe not that much of a barrier. Actually, report confirms that almost many people felt that it was much harder than expected finding employment and even learning the language, getting to be aware of people surrounding and yes, it was varies between the private sponsor and the government sponsor in a way. I think in some special circumstances, interesting enough, in some smaller cities, what I know that because the general theme that always privately sponsored refugees had a better support system around them than the government sponsored refugees. But in a way, I think end of 2016, early 2017, there were some cities and some kind of special circumstances where government-sponsored refugees actually got a lot of support, but they're coming from a community that arrived before them. Kind of, Marwa mentioned that a little bit more. It was also interesting in the report to see that it's actually captured like how many friends people would have and how many, that kind of a social capital that they get in there, which is a huge factor. And then we don't see this often in different places. I actually confirm a lot of ideas, a lot of observation that coming from the ground and working on the ground. It was really good, but it kind of also gave, at least to me or to people who might read it, will give a little bit more insight, especially when people kind of compare it with the boat people, because that's kind of where the mass that Canada in 1979, 1980 brought 60,000 boat people. And then we know that one of always the beautiful stories when we start seeing boat people actually sponsoring Syrian refugees coming at this point. I think to people who would read kind of the integration, the learning from that point, and then learning with the Syrians, this even would make the report a little bit more interesting. But yes, I mean, a lot of things in the report definitely confirm what we see and what we observe on the ground.
Great, thanks, Mustafa. Now, this report that Keith put together is fantastic. As you've heard a few panelists say, it covers a lot of detail. We're not going to have time to go into every one of the elements of the report tonight, but I want to focus, Keith, on three things. And if you can just summarize for the audience, A, language acquisition challenges faced by the Syrian refugees, B, mental health, and 3, employment and occupation. Or maybe we start with language acquisition. What were your findings? You're on mute, Keith.
My apologies. Can you hear me now? All right. Well, just again, very briefly, because there's lots to it. We asked about language fluency, both first when the refugees first arrived, and then when we interviewed them 5 or 6 years later. And as I think everybody on this panel would appreciate, and probably in the audience, most of the refugees arriving in 2015, 2016 had very limited fluency in English or French, particularly those who were the youngest. But over the 5 or 6 years, there was tremendous progress in listening and speaking and reading and writing across the board, where large majorities rated their own language fluency to be excellent or good. And those that started with the least fluency made up the most progress. So I think obviously there were a lot of language training supports put by governments and others in place. That was a real focus of settlement supports. We know that. And of course, people are immersed in English or French in the community, and no better way to learn a language than to have to speak it. So I think there was tremendous progress. As Mustafa said, there was a lot of language was much more difficult for some people than they thought it might be when they arrived. In terms of mental health, we don't have a lot in the report on mental health. I think I should point out that mental health is always a challenging subject to do research with, and takes special measures and precautions and approaches to do, particularly with a population that has experienced a lot of trauma. So we really weren't in this research able to go very deep into this. We did ask a couple of questions, and we found that the mental health levels were more positive than negative, more good than bad, but there was a real mix. And certainly mental health sort of assessments were not quite as positive as physical health. So there was some difference there. And again, I think this makes perfect sense. I imagine the others on the panel can speak to this from their on-the-ground experience. You talked about employment. I think that's the third area. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah. I think employment, again, no surprise, emerged as, I think, the most challenging area in terms of refugees getting established and developing new lives for themselves and their families. I think this is the case for many immigrants and newcomers, not just refugees. in some ways, refugees may have had extra assistance because of all the support that was, I think, directed their way. But certainly, many refugees said that they had more difficulty finding work and finding employment than they expected. Most were not working in their particular fields or professions. A majority said that there was not a good match between their skills and experience and the job they had. And it was the area of financial security and employment were the two areas of their lives where there was the least amount of satisfaction, generally speaking. And an area that I think that there were many had concerns about sort of their future prospects as well. So it's not all bad news. And as Talar said, there's a great entrepreneurial spirit, and there have been many businesses that have been created, some in the media spotlight, but many more than that. But nevertheless, this is a challenging area, as it is for anyone coming to this country.
Talar, I want to come to you next. I mean, you kind of lived the journey post your arrival that we're talking about here. Can you maybe share with us what it was like for you and your family?
It was significantly challenging, I can admit. The journey was not easy at all. So it required a lot of energy, patience, consistency, and somehow being optimistic helped me a lot. But I can admit it wasn't easy. You have to have like really, really good patience to overcome this situation.
Okay.
Because like immigration per se is difficult. On top of that, imagine that you came as a refugee with some financial burdens. It added additional level of kind of difficulties.
So Talar, Keith just touched on two elements, language acquisition and employment. You were a lawyer back in Syria. How did you navigate the system here in terms of employment? And for language acquisition, was that an issue for you, or did you already speak English prior to arriving here?
To be honest, like in Syria, like rarely people usually no one speaks English. However, so learning language was one of my let's say habits. So I was keen to learning languages. So even in Syria, so I was practicing my English language. So when I arrived here, my language level was significantly satisfactory. However, still like because of my dream, so I had to kind of develop my language skills even more. So I practiced a lot. In terms of the employment, yes. So I personally also like experienced the challenges in finding the employment, specifically the very first employment, having known that like Canadian like experience is something that is required here in Canada, specifically for the new arrivals, regardless of whether they are refugees or immigrants. That was a significant challenge for me. And then like going back to the let's say career that I used to practice in my home country of Syria. So it was significantly challenging because like there are some expectations, and I was able to navigate as to what the employers are expecting from an employee here. I believe primarily having known or educating myself about the to improve my knowledge about the culture, Canadian culture, helped me a lot, because like one of the key aspects of like being successful here in Canada, specifically in the employment sector, so to know what the employer is expecting and how to deal with people around you, I believe like those are the key aspects that helped me a lot.
Great. And Talar, Keith mentioned, many of the people interviewed talked about the amazing supports that there were that helped them through some of these challenges. Were you sort of independent in terms of how you managed this, or did you rely on any kind of organizational support, settlement agencies, that sort of thing?
No, when I first arrived here, so I literally, I didn't know anyone. So I was like alone with my family. So thanks to my research skills, I primarily relied on Google research. I can say that I was alone. I had to navigate everything. I had zero knowledge as to what the journey looks like. However, so we're doing a lot of research and directly getting in touch with the organizations. What I'm trying to say by organization, not the settlement organizations, but maybe the universities or kind of like one of the organizations that I'm mentioning is the OS for credential evaluation. So these type of organizations that I had to directly contact in order to like obtain further knowledge. This is how I managed the situation then.
Before I pass over to Marwa to talk about mental health, I want to ask one last question, Talar, and that is now 8 years later, after arriving, what are your thoughts about Canada, about the process? Is this now home for you, or do you consider yourself still very much attached?
Without any doubt, Canada is my home, without any single doubt at all. So I wish if I had arrived like earlier, that would have been, the journey would have been like easier for me. But thanks God. So I am in the place that I was dreaming 6 or 7 years ago. Yes, so I'm perfectly happy, and I wouldn't have asked for a better country than Canada. This is my home, with no doubt, with zero doubt.
Great. I do want to remind the audience that if you want to type in your questions in the chat box, either directly into the Q&A tab on Zoom or the live chat box on YouTube, I'll be sure to relay it to the panelists. Marwa, Keith mentioned that mental health wasn't an area in the report that was, asked about because of the challenges with that. But I'm sure from your vantage point at Syrian Canadian Foundation, you would have seen many cases. How would you describe to the audience sort of the general sense of how that challenge was met by individuals and families?
Well, to begin with, there's really a lot of pressure and high expectation that every refugee is expected that they're going to successfully integrate within the first 12 months when they come to Canada. They're expected to learn the language, they're expected to find a job and contribute to the community. And therefore, we have noticed that year 2 is when most of our clients and participants, that's where I feel like it hits. It's like, I'm in a new country, I feel overwhelmed. A year passed by and I'm not fluent in English. I still didn't find a job that really matches my skill set. And I feel like I'm losing my culture, my religion as well. So there's a lot of factors that really overwhelms refugees and newcomers when they come, especially after the first year have passed. And then exactly what Talar mentioned, many of them feel like they're on their own. Many settlement agencies are involved in the first, I would say, initial first few months, and then most families are on their own. They have to build their own connection. They have to ask whether relatives or people in the community to help them and support them. That's where SCF really started to implement mental health programs, I would say year 2. We have started working with the family, like the mother, father, and the kids, having an integrated and building bridge between both. We have noticed that many of the fathers, I would say the male figures in the family, were really facing a lot of depression and anxiety. And the mother is the one who is really holding the family together. She's progressing in terms of language. She's trying to run her own business, whether it's opening a catering business from her home or trying to work to provide for the family. And therefore, we really try to come up with mental health programs that are culturally sensitive and being able to break the stigma also in our culture, because mental health is not really, we don't talk about it openly, we don't talk about therapy, and it took a lot of time for us to break that stigma. But I'm really proud of really the progress that we have seen in the families. Now we have also a program that we almost do every year called Sawa, which means togetherness in Arabic, funded by the Halton region. And what we have decided to do is really emphasize on the importance of therapy for the whole family. And we provide free therapy sessions, one-on-one sessions with an Arabic-speaking psychiatrist. So we have noticed there was a lot of improvements. We were able to break the stigma towards the very end of the program. Majority of the participants utilized these free therapy sessions that we have, and they came back and they were asking for more. And that's the struggle that SCF had, that we wanted to help more. Okay, we shared awareness, we talked about mental health issues, we want to help them, but now there is financial barrier and language barrier from the government, because as we all know, therapy is expensive here and there's a long waiting list if I refer them to other organizations, and which we tried. Then they came back to me and they're like, we're on a waiting list for 8 or 9 months. And most of these families have gone through a lot of trauma, and they need, it's basically considered emergency support. They can't afford waiting a year or 9 months for therapy sessions. So that's something that we're really struggling with. And we're hoping that we're able to either change a policy or influence that these refugees and newcomers are indeed in need of these type of support. We, as important as physical health is for us, mental health should be also covered and supported and provided for refugees and newcomers here in order for them to thrive and give back to the community and integrate successfully.
Good. Great. Thanks, Marwa. Keith, I have an audience question from Tony, who is curious if you are able from the research to tell, like, what percentage of the Syrian refugees you spoke to received actual support from settlement agencies, like Jumpstart or SCF?
We didn't get into the details of specific organizations. We really didn't want to burrow into that. And of course, it's a national sample. But we asked about the kinds of support that they received from government, from private sponsors, and not surprisingly, large proportions, large majorities talked about language training, help with finding housing, helping open a bank account, help with transportation. Some refugees needed a lot of support and help from settlement agencies and others. Some refugees were privately sponsored by family and friends. And so they had a personal connection, unlike Talar, where some of these things were handled by family members and other people in their community. So there really was a range in terms of the needs. We asked about the kinds of support that people found most helpful. And so people identified some practical issues like finding housing, but also high the list was emotional support. So a lot of refugees, when we asked them about their early year or two, what was most helpful, some of them talked about the support they got from their private sponsors or from other Canadians. So there were a lot of ways in which people were helped, and I think it's correct to say, from our understanding and talking to various people involved in this, that the mobilization of Canadian institutions and citizens for this cohort of refugees was unparalleled, even beyond perhaps what happened with Vietnamese and Laotian refugees 40 or so years ago. I think that governments at all levels, settlement agencies, civic organizations, citizens really rose to this, in some cases in almost spontaneous way, that really, I think, made a difference. And I think it's the kind of support that is difficult to sustain. And I think, the challenge now is to mobilize the support that's needed for other groups of refugees who are now coming.
Thanks, Keith. Now, Mustafa, at our seat, you have sort of a global panoramic view. One of the audience is asking, could you talk about the range of experiences, being a refugee, not only across the different provinces in Canada, if there was a difference or it was pretty standardized across, or other countries outside of Canada? Did you see any differences there, provincial or global?
I mean, provincial, I don't think there was much differences. Definitely there were kind of a little bit technical differences, especially when accessing, for example, people in trade, where they have to be certified in different ways. Some physicians, for example, in Quebec, need a little bit, and they're more rigorous on regulation than other provinces, and that kind of a little bit different. In terms of globally what refugee experience, Canada always known and has a kind of a global image of being a country that is almost everyone wanted to come to, many refugees in different places. And while a lot of that is true, but at the same time, there's a lot of what we call it kind of a more of a media of an image that kind of a little bit overrated in a way. And not to say that Canada is not great, absolutely it's great, but many of those, and kind of to be more particular, for example, refugees who goes to European countries, it takes them about 9 years, or all the way between 5 to 9 years, or even 10 years, in just getting a citizenship if they get it, for example, and then others, and the statuses of refugees, for example, refugees in Germany and other European countries, they might have about 9 different statuses. That's very complicated to them in a way. However, what happened, kind of the social support system for them in a European country is better than Canada in terms of basically the welfare state and all of that. And kind of once I wrote kind of a little bit an article comparing Germany to Canada, is if you look at integration and inclusion from 1 to 8, often, many other states in Europe would do great job from 1 to 8, but then they're not doing the best job from 8 to 10, which is the pathway to citizenship. But then Canada doing a mediocre job, let's say, kind of from 1 to 8 when it comes to providing services, but doing a great job when it comes to, the clear path to citizenship. And to people, and especially to refugees who are seeking safety, this is the ultimate prize. That's really what they're looking for. Kind of, how access to safety and no matter what kind of, a good services you provide people, if they feel that they're living in limbo and then their future is not clear, and especially people coming from precarious statuses, like today, refugees staying about over 20 years in states or kind of a hosting states before arriving into resettlement countries. So that's a long time in a way, and definitely that's kind of a little bit different. I think Canada absolutely has a great program and support, and it's a country. I mean, we always say is people are lucky to come to Canada, but at the same time, Canada is lucky with the people coming to it, because it's a country that builds on refugees and immigrants, and without them, it can't sustain itself. It's just as simple as that. But at the same time, Canada has a lot of opportunity in terms of improving the system. When we talk about, we talk about credentials, we talk about employment, we talk about kind of that kind of a financial sustainability. And it's no news that financial sustainability and financial integration kind of correlate and work hand to hand with the mental health of people in there. When they have that kind of stability, their mental health is a little bit better, so their integration is a little bit faster. And I think this is an area where we feel Canada needs to work on from that perspective.
Thank you, Mustafa. Talar, Amina in the audience has a question for you. So you were a lawyer back in Syria, and she's asking, were you able to restart your career in law here after resettlement? And if so, how long did it take you? And if not, what were the barriers you faced?
Yes, definitely. I was practicing law in Syria, and everyone knows that Syria is a civil law jurisdiction country, and whereas here is a common law jurisdiction. So the law in both jurisdictions are significantly different. I wasn't able to practice law for sure. Once I arrived here, I had to go through many challenges. So the starting point for any internationally trained lawyer is to contact the NCA, National Committee for the Accreditation. Where the organization that decides, depending on the country that you came from, so how many subjects you have to take in order to get the certificate of qualification, to have the chance to write the bar exam, both bar exams, barrister and solicitor, and go through the training portion of the licensing process. So basically you have to clear all the subjects that NCA requires an international trained lawyer, and then you will become eligible to go through the licensing process that Law Society of Ontario, in my case, required me to go through. When it comes to the period, yes, it definitely takes no lesser than 3 years re-qualified as a lawyer for me in Ontario, but I believe the processes are similar in other provinces as well.
Thank you, Taylor. Marwa, Barb in the audience is asking, what would you suggest that Canadian organizations do to support Syrian newcomers with more fulfilling employment opportunities? Any sort of suggestions?
Yeah, so based on what we have noticed, that many of the newcomers, refugees who want to transfer their skill set or be able to find a meaningful employment that does match their experience back home, there are many employment training opportunities, but many of them are unpaid, and they're expected that the participant or the refugee or the newcomer would be joining for months, and they're providing for their family, taking care of them. So one of the components that we really are trying with SCF and recommending with other organizations is to provide paid specialized training sessions for newcomers and refugees. And at the same time, after they're done with the training, to advocate and match them with Canadian employers who are willing to either give them internship opportunities or employment opportunities. Because we have, again, a lot of expectations and pressure that do this training and do this certificate, and after they do everything that they've been told, they try to conduct interviews and try to secure an employment opportunity. Nobody's giving them that chance. Nobody's trusting their ability and skill set that they had just because they lack the Canadian experience, and they're considered refugees and newcomers, and they don't want to take that risk. So I think advocating and connecting and building bridge with Canadian employers would really help in changing the mindset. And I can see that these changes have started to happen, but of course there's more work to be done.
And Mustafa, you were co-founder of Jumpstart, which focused on meaningful employment. Anything to add to answering Barb's question about what can Canadian organizations do?
I mean, a few things, because kind of for working on employment and until now that work on, like I work in this space and economic integration, it requires both and that the clients are not only the refugees or the newcomers, the clients also are the government, the union, the credential bodies and employers, that there is, I think there is a need to work with those as much as there is a need to work with refugee clients in particular. I think on the other aspects that we've seen, often many organizations are stuck into programs that being designed and performed for the longest time ever. And often here we say kind of the newcomers. And those programs are expected to basically or tailored to immigrants and refugees and given the circumstances and different circumstances that refugees go through, I think initial support and initial kind of a little bit more specialized program that focus on refugees barriers in particular would do a better job based on my experience and our experience within kind of a Jumpstart, and kind of a little bit to think not completely to say kind of to think out of the box, but just trying to adapt to the change in the job market. If there are programs today that being in place and continue to deliver, for example, kind of a resume writing or kind of a little bit more kind of a training on certain skills, we have some programs that have been in place for years and years, but then you look at the job market in the last 5 years, it's completely different. So also organization trying to adapt to that change in the skills that need to be trained on, and maybe kind of a change in terms of what employers might expect of them. And again, just to be a little bit more, at least in the beginning, to have a little bit more specialized program that kind of have a little bit more or be aware of the refugee circumstances when delivering services, and employing people with lived experience within those organizations. Just have the refugees themselves to work together with those organizations, because this is also one of the gaps that once it's addressed, I think one of the key successes of Jumpstart growing as an organization within 5 years to a global, basically national, now actually we're hiring global staff. So growing kind of to that much, and we've had multiple awards and we have a lot of success. And I think one of the reasons was that kind of a process to adapt and to employ people with lived experience so they can actually work better and they understand in terms of when we design the program, when we create those kind of programs, and again, with the focus on refugees. So but at the same time, those kind of few things organizations should work on. But I don't want to discredit also a lot of work that employers and governments and credential bodies also need to work on in order to bridge that gap. I think the last point to people like here to mention that Canada loses on yearly basis based on the last report a few years ago came out of CIBC about $40 to $60 billion in underemployment. And this is because of people who are doctors or managers or business analysts right now working in entry-level jobs, and we're losing on their taxes and potentials. And at the end, the loss is not only on basically that those people are affected by this loss, but actually all Canadians in Canada are affected by those kind of loss.
Okay, well said, Mustafa. Keith, now there were three channels or streams rather of government admissions of refugees back in 2015, 2016. There was one government assisted refugee stream, two, a private sponsored refugee stream, and three, the blended visa office refugees. In your research, did you find any measurable differences in terms of settlement success with these three streams?
Well, it's one of the things that we were particularly interested in looking at. And I think it's clear, and I think the other panelists will confirm this, that most of the refugees who were privately sponsored had additional types of support, more maybe personalized support, not across the board, but generally there was more attention, I think, more personal attention that they received. And so I think it certainly gave them a bit of an advantage. And, some of the questions we asked our privately sponsored refugees, they were very positive about the experience. A majority of them said that support was essential. They could not have managed without it. Excuse me. Most of them felt that their sponsors struck a right balance between not giving too much support and giving about the right amount without being patronizing or over-managing. And I think what's most striking with them is that about 70% of the refugees that were privately sponsored are still in touch with their private sponsors years later. So it suggests that there was a connection there that was really important and useful. All that being said, when we interviewed people 5 or 6 years after arriving, the sort of outcomes that we were measuring in terms of life satisfaction and how they were doing with the job market and how their families were, there were very few differences between privately sponsored and government sponsored refugees. So that those differences, those early differences, seem to have largely disappeared for the most part. And again, we only interviewed a sample of refugees. So there obviously would be exceptions and situations where this is not the case. But for the most part, we found that there were surprisingly few differences. And while privately sponsored refugees had some early advantages, that didn't make that much difference in the long run. But I would be interested in hearing what the other panelists have to say about this.
Any opinions, Marwa, Mustafa, Talar?
I've read, I believe, Keith's report, and it really echoes 40,000 Syrians' voice. It echoes my voice as well. So I believe it 100% reflects what each and every Syrian refugee thinks about the reality and the challenges that they went through and they are going through. I think there is no further thing to add to the report. So it's interesting report, and it's highly recommended to all those who wants to know the reality after Syrian refugees and the challenge that they all went through.
Okay. Keith, one of the audience members, I think missed you at the very beginning, but how can someone get a copy of your report, Keith?
Well, thank you for asking. So a copy of our report is available on our website. It's environicsinstitute.org. And there are a couple of tabs where people can go and find the report. We actually have 3 reports to offer. We have a detailed 90-page report, if you want all the details. We have a 20-page executive summary, and we have just posted a brand new overview, which is really a very concise story about the project, complete with pictures and just a few charts. It's a very quick read. And I will point out that some of our documents are in Arabic. The executive summary is in Arabic. Our overview will soon be in Arabic as well. So there's lots of detail. There are also data tables on our website if you really want to dig into the numbers. So there's lots of information that we're keen to share with anyone who's interested.
Keith, we have Dr. Judy asking the question, what percentage of refugees in your interviews were educated and literate in their mother tongue language? And was there any kind of correlation between that educational background and the impact of their feelings of settlement and integration?
Well, that's an interesting question. You know, I don't have time here to get into the details. I think those with more education obviously, had some advantages. I will say that those with higher levels of education tended to be less satisfied with their employment situation, I think, because they had more to offer than those with less. Despite what we did measure sort of fluency in English or French, but we offered our refugees the opportunity to be interviewed in whatever language they wanted, and 87% opted to be interviewed in Arabic. Which is just fine and probably makes sense. It's their native tongue. I think almost everybody, there were a handful of our participants whose first language was not Arabic. Was another Middle Eastern language, but Arabic was the dominant one. So almost everyone chose to be interviewed in Arabic, and that's how we proceeded.
I saw one piece in Aramaic actually. It was interesting, which is a language. I don't know, Darrell, if you know that. Like in Syria, there are 2 cities. They're the only 2 cities in the world right now that continue to speak Eastern Aramaic, which is the language of Jesus at that point. So it was interesting. Actually, one of the people had this as a first time.
Yes,
it was very pleasing to see.
Yes, I hope that answers the question.
It does. Thank you so much, Keith. Mustafa, I'm going to start with you here. I'm actually going to run the horn and ask everyone this question, but I'll start with you. Looking back, if you could pick one thing, just one thing that worked really well with the resettlement effort with Syrians, and then one thing that, from your vantage point, could have been improved, what would you single out there?
It's easier to answer the first part.
Well, I was thinking about that.
Yeah, I think one thing that worked really well, the arrival of Syrian refugees in Canada was kind of the announcement of the community sponsorship, or kind of a private sponsorship 2.0 model, where Keith talked a little bit more, because often before that, when the Vietnamese or the Hungarians or many kind of before, it was often faith-based organization that would lead in terms of resettling refugees and all of that. With the Syrians, for the first time, we start seeing that kind of the public getting involved. We start seeing book clubs and condo buildings and private sectors, and group of friends start getting together and all of that. And that worked really well. That contributed to a lot of, relieving a lot of pressure on governments and organizations, but at the same time, improving in kind of the quality of integration and the quality of we talked about the kind of the social capital, which is a pretty good in there. And this is something, by the way, like even recently, US has announced their private sponsorship, and the whole model basically is built on this. So it's like basically the Canadian private sponsorship 2.0, which is the involvement of the public and the private and all of that. And this absolutely is the winner when it comes to, what was the best thing ever happened with the arrival of Syrian refugees, which is, again, not only for the privately sponsored refugees, but the public involvement also supported kind of government sponsored refugees. We start seeing groups and people, again, just going and outpouring this. And I hope there is a process that we can sustain that. I hope there is a process that we can sustain this kind of a public engagement in a way. I think the one thing that might did not work best, I don't know if we can change this. It's just kind of the idea of the ad hoc with Syrian, and we start seeing this right now with Ukrainian and more refugees kind of thing, where we see more and more of what we call it kind of the ad hoc policies, that people are arriving, there isn't a program or a system in place that could, sustain or provide services in a way that are customized. Not kind of, there isn't capacity. I think there is a capacity, but it just, how to respond to that capacity and what kind of the best program that we have and all of this, just kind of for the organizations and other systems to be a little bit more prepared. That also happened with the Syrians. Like all of a sudden, in I don't know, like in less than 4 or 6 months, we start seeing over 30,000 refugees coming into different places with different needs. And the country was 30 years since the last time that got this kind of, a big number of refugees. We get refugees every year, around 16,000. But yeah, I think maybe we always say that we try to work on a system that is proactive, not reactive. I think the reactiveness in the system was one of the challenging things when Syrians came.
Okay. Talar, from your own personal experience, one thing that worked really well and one thing you think could have been improved?
Yes, what worked well is not only specifically the government help. Again, I was privately sponsored. However, like just because the fact that we had our permanent resident status right from the outset of our arrival, so it helped a lot for to access the assistance programs that each and every Syrian refugee needed, depending on their needs. For instance, for my situation, I benefited from the OSAP. Had I not been for the permanent resident status, I wouldn't have applied for the OSAP and I wouldn't have realized my dream, for instance. But what didn't work well, that I believe the settlement agencies were not well prepared or not prepared to kind of like welcome that amount of refugees during a very limited time. So I believe the number of refugees were not in alliance with the availability of those organizations then to help each and every individual, depending on what their needs were at that time.
Okay. Marwa, what about you? One thing. We can't hear you any longer. I'll tell you what, as you're fixing the audio, we'll come to Keith. Keith, one thing that worked really well and one thing you think, could have been improved.
Yeah, well, I think, what really, this comes from the research, I think what really stood out, and this builds on Mustafa's comments, is that almost all of the people, the refugees that we interviewed, felt accepted in the local communities where they settled, whether it was urban or rural or whatever. Most of them felt accepted. They felt that other Canadians had positive opinions of Syrian refugees. They felt safe and secure, and it was one of the things I liked best about being in Canada. So I think in many ways, the country really embraced these individuals in a way that perhaps they wouldn't have in a European country or someone else. I think somebody made that point. So I think that, that worked out beautifully. And just to speak to Mustafa's point about private citizens and how this might proceed, we did a separate study of Canadians testing the market for being private sponsors. We did this 2 years ago. And we found that there are several million Canadians who are keen to get involved in this, given the opportunity. So there's clearly a demand in the population to get involved, and there's much more potential. Very quickly on the negative side, I think it's around employment supports. I think it's where many refugees struggle the most, and I think in hindsight, there may have been more attention in sort of settlement services to find ways to match refugees with potential placements that would have made a big difference.
Thanks, Keith. Marwa, if your audio is back on, I'm going to give you the last word.
Okay, can you hear me now? Sorry, my AirPods are dying, so I hope it lasts for another minute. So briefly, I think one thing that really worked well is the community response, whether it's from Syrians or non-Syrians. There was tremendous support to Syrian refugees, and the mentorship component. They established a lot of friendship between Canadian sponsors, Canadian volunteers who were matching with refugee families, and I have seen that relationship flourish and last until this day, which is 5-6 years. And they really help them through accessing and navigating the government services and the support they actually need. And this is something that we always advocate and always encourage people in the community to support, not just because back then there was a hype, there was a lot of media coverage about Syrian refugees, but we really encourage Canadian community members who are involved in the refugee sector to support and have this one-on-one relationship with the whole family. Now, one thing that I think did not work back then, and I know that we can't change the past, but due to the fact that thousands came at once and it was overwhelming for settlement agencies to really provide the right services and support needed, there was a lot of lack of services when it came to language support. Many of the families had to be on a waiting list for 7 or 8 months in order for them to access LINK program because there was no space. They were not equipped, they were not prepared for that volume of refugees coming at once. And that's where grassroots organizations stepped in, like SDF, when we provided English tutoring program just to kind of improve their conversational skills until they're able to access the LINK program and improve their language. And reflecting on Keith's report, it does show that it was one of the main barriers that newcomers and refugees are facing, which is language. It's taking more time than we expect and that they expect. So they 100% need additional support on that. And this is SDF's main expertise. It's one of our first and main program since its inception. And now we're trying to be innovative. We're trying to use technology through language training program. We're using VR and AI, hope that we can accelerate their speaking skills and conversational skills in a faster way so they can thrive and hopefully secure employment opportunities faster.
Wonderful. Well, listen, this hour has just really flown by. We're at time, and there was a few audience questions I couldn't get to. But I do want to, I'll come back to thank you all. Once again, Keith's full report is available at environicsinstitute.org. This was a Talking Point episode brought to you by New Canadians TV. And you can catch New Canadians on in Canada on Omni Television all across the country, also on YouTube and their website at newcanadians.tv, where you can actually sign up for their monthly newsletter. If you want to get notified about upcoming episodes of Talking Point, you can follow New Canadians' social media channels on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and the Telegram messaging app. There's going to be a short poll for those audience members. If you take a few minutes to sign that out, that'd be very much appreciated. And finally, a huge thank you to our panelists, Marwa, Keith, Mustafa, and Talar, for sharing your thoughts and experiences today. And to all the audience members, thank you for your participation and your wonderful questions. See you all next time.